Hello there, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to step far back in time, into a world both familiar and utterly alien. Imagine a planet wrapped in cold, where vast sheets of ice stretched across continents, where towering animals wandered through frozen grasslands, and where our own ancestors huddled close to flickering fires, carving tools and stories into bone and stone. This is the Ice Age. Not a single moment, but an era that unfolded over millions of years, shaping the Earth we know today in ways we're still uncovering. It's a time of survival, quiet brilliance, and deep connection, when humanity was still learning what it meant to be human. As you listen, picture that distant world, the crunch of snow beneath ancient footsteps, the glow of firelight against the dark, and the long, slow rhythm of the earth breathing through cycles of cold and warmth. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're joining from tonight. If you enjoy what I'm doing here, tell me what time it is, where you are, and where in the world you're listening from. It's always wonderful to see our little midnight community growing across the map. Now, take a moment to settle in. Maybe you're listening late at night with the quiet hum of the world around you. Maybe you're just curious, searching for a calm place to drift while you learn. Either way, let's make this a slow journey, one where you don't need to rush or keep track of the clock. Because while the Ice Age was cold, it moved at a pace so gradual that entire lifetimes passed without anyone noticing the world was changing. The first thing to understand is that the Ice Age wasn't just one long freeze. It was a cycle, a rhythm of cold glacial periods and warmer intervals in between, called interglacials. Earth's climate shifted back and forth over tens of thousands of years, driven by subtle changes in the planet's orbit, its tilt, and even the way it wobbled like a spinning top. These changes in sunlight reshaped the world so completely that oceans receded, land bridges rose, and entire ecosystems came and went like tides on a much larger scale. But let's not start with the science just yet. Picture instead the world itself. You're standing on what will one day be Northern Europe or North America or Siberia. The horizon is not filled with cities or forests. Instead, there's a wall of ice, hundreds of meters high, stretching farther than the eye can see. The air is sharp, dry, and heavy with the scent of snow. And yet, despite the cold, the landscape isn't lifeless. Out on the frozen plains roam herds of woolly mammoths, their curved tusks glinting faintly in the pale light. Giant ground sloths lumber across the land in the Americas, while saber-toothed cats crouch low in the grass, their muscles coiled, their long teeth catching the light like polished ivory. Farther south, where the ice never reached, there are still forests and rivers, and in those warmer pockets, humans are finding ways to survive. They follow the herds, hunt with spears tipped in stone, and gather around fires to share the little warmth the world allows. They don't know they live in what we now call the Ice Age. For them, it's just life. And this is the strange thing about the deep past. It wasn't a frozen wasteland from pole to pole. While the northern continents were locked under ice, the equator was still warm enough for jungles and deserts to exist. Life adapted. It moved. It endured. The Earth during the Ice Age was not only colder, it was wilder, sharper, and full of contrasts. The story begins long before humans entered the picture. For millions of years, our planet has shifted between cold and warm periods, each one leaving marks in stone and soil. Scientists have pieced this together from clues hidden in ice cores drilled deep into Antarctica and Greenland. Layer by layer, these cores trap tiny bubbles of ancient air, giving us a record of what the atmosphere was like hundreds of thousands of years ago. From them, we know that the Ice Age didn't arrive all at once. It crept forward, glaciers advancing slowly, then retreating, then advancing again, like a tide grinding rock into dust. As the ice grew, it reshaped the land beneath it. Mountains were carved into jagged peaks. Valleys deepened. Enormous boulders were pushed across the landscape like pebbles left behind when the glaciers finally pulled back. Even now, if you walk through parts of Canada, Scandinavia, or the northern United States, you can still see these marks. Lakes scoured out by moving ice, U-shaped valleys that tell of glaciers long gone, and rocks carried hundreds of kilometers from where they first formed. But it wasn't only the land that changed. The oceans dropped by more than 100 meters as water became locked up in the ice sheets. Entire continents grew larger. Asia and North America were joined by a land bridge we now call Beringia, a frozen highway across what is now the Bering Strait. This bridge didn't just shape geography, it shaped history. It allowed humans and animals to migrate between continents, spreading life across the globe in ways that would echo for thousands of years. Imagine standing on that bridge. The wind cuts across the open tundra, carrying snow that never quite settles. Herds of caribou and mammoth move in steady lines, grazing on the sparse, dry grass that somehow survives here. Wolves stalk them at a distance, their fur thick against the cold, and following it all, small groups of humans trudge forward, wrapped in furs, their breath curling in the air. Every step they take brings them closer to a new world. What's remarkable is how interconnected everything was. When the ice grew, the Earth dried up because so much of the planet's water was locked away in the ice sheets. Deserts expanded, and the great tropical forest shrank. Where there once was endless green, now there were open plains stretching for miles. This vast steppe environment, the Mammoth steppe, as scientists sometimes call it, covered much of Europe, Asia, and North America. It was harsh, but it was rich in life. Home to vast herds of grazing animals that could support both predators and the first human hunters brave enough to follow them. Yet, for all its scale and severity, the Ice Age wasn't unchanging.
Every few tens of thousands of years, the ice retreated, temperatures rose, and the planet greened again. Rivers swelled, forests returned, and the great grassland shrank. These warmer periods didn't last forever. Inevitably, the glaciers crept forward once more, slow but relentless, until the world froze again. It was during one of these warmer intervals that humans began to flourish, learning to shape stone into blades, to paint their lives onto cave walls, and eventually to step out of the Ice Age world entirely and into what we now call history. Even so, the fingerprints of that frozen era never disappeared. We see it not only in the land, but in ourselves. Our migrations, our myths, even our bodies still carry traces of that time. And to truly understand the Earth we live on now, we have to walk back into that frozen world, to watch the ice move and the great animals roam, and to remember that the world has been many things before it became this one. And so, let's keep walking into the cold. The wind is rising and the horizon is white with snow. But there's more to see, because this is only the beginning, and the Ice Age has much more to show us. The beginning. The cold did not come suddenly. It crept across the earth in slow, quiet waves, so gradual that no single lifetime could have felt the change. But over thousands of years, the transformation was unstoppable. It began with small shifts in the planet's orbit, tilts and wobbles so slight they would seem meaningless to anyone standing on the ground. Yet these subtle motions changed how much sunlight reached the northern parts of the world, and little by little, summers became cooler. Snow that once melted each year began to linger, and over time that lingering snow hardened into ice. It is almost impossible to imagine how different the world looked before that transformation began. Much of the northern continents were green, covered in forests and open plains. Rivers ran freely, and animals grazed across lands that today we know only as frozen tundra. But as the centuries passed, and each summer failed to erase the snows of the previous winter, a slow accumulation began, layer after layer, year after year, until the snow packed down under its own weight and became ice. From those beginnings, the first glaciers grew, and once they started to move, nothing could stop them. The great ice sheets did not simply appear. They advanced like armies, inch by inch. At their peak, these glaciers were so massive they buried entire landscapes, swallowing mountains and valleys alike. The Laurentide ice sheet stretched across much of North America, blanketing Canada and reaching deep into what is now the United States. In Europe, the Fenno-Scandinavian ice sheet covered Scandinavia and pushed southward, reshaping the land with its crushing weight. In the southern hemisphere, even the highlands of South America and New Zealand bore their own icy crowns. The air itself changed as the world cooled. When so much water was locked up in ice, the oceans fell, exposing wide stretches of land that had once been hidden beneath the waves. Winds scoured the open plains, carrying dust for hundreds of miles, settling it in thick layers that still lie buried beneath the soil in parts of China and the American Midwest. In these dry, windy conditions, forests withered, grasslands spread. Entire ecosystems shifted southward in search of warmth. But Earth is not a simple machine. Its climate has always been the result of many forces working together. And while orbital changes began the process, they weren't alone in shaping the Ice Age. Volcanic eruptions sent ash and gas into the sky, dimming the sunlight and cooling the atmosphere even further. The oceans, too, played their part, as currents shifted and locked more heat into the deep. Over time, this feedback loop of cooling built upon itself until the planet settled into a state very different from the one we know today. Yet even in this frozen world, life endured. Plants adapted to the cold, spreading across the edges of the glaciers, while hardy grasses colonized the vast steppes. Animals followed. Woolly mammoths and mastodons, their heavy coats and thick fats suited to the bitter winds, roamed in enormous herds. Bison, muskox, and reindeer ranged across the open plains, grazing endlessly on the dry tundra. Predators thrived as well. Saber-toothed cats lurked in the shadows of the grasslands, while packs of dire wolves tracked the herds across the snow. And beyond the great animals, there were the smaller survivors, foxes darting between drifts of snow, birds migrating along ancient routes, rodents tunneling into the frozen earth. Every living thing carved out its niche, shaped by a world where the rules of survival were harsh but constant. Humans entered this stage much later, but even before their arrival, the Ice Age had already written its mark into the land. As glaciers expanded, they scraped deep grooves into the earth, crushing rock and grinding it into fine powder. When the ice retreated, it left behind a landscape that was raw and new, dotted with lakes and rivers formed from the meltwater. In some places, it left behind enormous piles of stone and gravel, the ruins of its long, slow advance. These were not just changes to the scenery. They were the foundations of the world we walk on now. In many ways, this period was both violent and quiet. Glaciers moved with relentless force, but their progress was almost invisible on the scale of a single human life. Mountains bowed under their weight, yet an animal could live its entire existence in the shadow of that ice without seeing it move an inch.
That is the scale of deep time, where the drama of the Earth unfolds in increments too slow for any one pair of eyes to see, and yet leaves marks that last for millions of years. If you could have stood on the edge of one of those early glaciers, you would have felt it. Not in the way you feel a storm or a sudden gust of wind, but in the quiet heaviness of the air, the faint groan of shifting ice, and the endless stillness of a frozen horizon. The sky would be pale and dry, the sun low, the land silent except for the distant crack of the ice as it crept forward. But this was only the beginning. Over time, the cold deepened, the glaciers grew larger, and the world entered one of the most dramatic periods in its history. Yet, this frozen planet was not dead. It was changing, shaping the land, the seas, and eventually the fate of the humans who would learn to survive within it. And so, the stage was set. A planet wrapped in ice, a landscape carved by forces too vast to see, and a world where survival would mean adaptation in ways no creature had ever faced before. The great herds came first. Imagine an endless plain, cold and wind-scoured, but alive with movement. Woolly mammoths marched in long lines, their shaggy coats swaying like curtains of coarse hair, their curved tusks sweeping the air as they dug through the snow for grass. These were not rare, solitary beasts. They gathered in groups by the dozens, sometimes hundreds, moving across the steppe in search of food. Their footprints pressed deep into the frozen ground, carving paths that stretched for miles. Alongside them roamed the mastodons, stockier cousins of the mammoths, their shorter legs and straighter tusks suited for the mixed forest that clung to the edges of the glacial plains. They tore at branches and bark with steady determination, stripping the land bare as they moved from one patch of sheltering trees to the next. But the mammoths and mastodons were only part of this frozen parade. The grasslands themselves were alive with bison, their heavy shoulders and thick fur shields against the cutting wind. Musk oxen, low and broad, clustered in tight defensive circles when predators drew near. Reindeer, ancestors of the caribou, migrated endlessly, their hooves striking the hard ground in a rhythm as old as the glaciers themselves. Predators followed. Dire wolves prowled the edges of the herds, larger and stronger than their modern descendants, their teeth built for crushing bone. Saber-toothed cats, with their long, curved fangs, lay in wait among the sparse shrubs, ready to bring down prey many times their size. And even the towering lions, leaner but nearly twice the weight of today's lions, ranged across the steppes, hunting in coordinated groups that could challenge even the most formidable prey. And out-towering this already harsh and dramatic world were the glaciers themselves. These titanic rivers of ice loomed in the distance like frozen walls, their sheer faces fractured with deep blue crevices. They moved slowly, but their presence was impossible to ignore. The air near them carried a chill that cut straight through the thickest fur. Each crack of shifting ice echoed for miles, a deep sound that reminded every living thing of the power lying just beyond reach. Yet for all their dominance, the glaciers were not static. They advanced and retreated, grinding across the continents,
scouring away the soil and reshaping the world beneath them. Where they passed, they left behind bare stone, scraped clean by their slow and merciless weight. They carved valleys that later filled with rivers and lakes. They created cliffs and ridges that shaped the migration paths of animals, forcing them into new lands, and in doing so, creating new opportunities for the predators that hunted them. In the shadow of those glaciers, life persisted. It adapted in ways that seem almost impossible today. Many of the great Ice Age animals carried thick layers of fat beneath their hides, insulation against the bitter cold. Their coats were dense, not just fur, but underlayers of wool so fine that it trapped heat close to the skin. Even their blood was different. Some species evolved the ability to circulate warmth more efficiently, keeping their limbs from freezing even in the harshest winds. Humans, too, learned to live alongside these giants. For our ancestors, the presence of mammoths was not only a danger, but a lifeline. From their bones came shelter. From their hides came clothing. From their meat came the calories that allowed small bands of hunters to survive in a world where food could be scarce and the nights were long and bitter. And still, the scale of the Ice Age world could dwarf any one life. A single glacier could stretch for hundreds of miles. A herd of mammoths could take days to pass from one horizon to the other. Even the sky seemed larger. Its pale light reflected off snow and ice in every direction. This was not a world made for comfort. It was a world that demanded endurance, and in return, it forged creatures, both human and animal, into survivors of extraordinary resilience. To stand there on that cold and windswept land would have been to see the earth in one of its rawest forms. The air sharp enough to sting, the sound of distant glaciers shifting like the groan of an ancient beast, the sight of animals larger than houses moving in slow, deliberate lines across the horizon. Every part of it spoke of a planet reshaped by forces far beyond any single creature's control. And yet there was a balance in it. The glaciers advanced, but they also retreated. The giants thrived, but they also fell to hunters or vanished into the snow when food grew scarce. Life persisted not because it conquered the cold, but because it learned to live within it. As the world moved through these frozen millennia, this balance would be tested again and again. The climate shifted.
Ice gave way to warmth, then returned. Animals migrated, adapted, or disappeared. And somewhere in the midst of it, humans kept learning, watching, and following the slow dance of the earth and its ice-bound giants. Now, as we move further into this frozen past, the focus turns to the engine that drove it all. The strange, intricate changes in the planet's climate, and how they set every one of these events into motion. The cold was never steady. Even at the height of the Ice Age, the Earth was not locked in one unchanging freeze. It breathed. Over tens of thousands of years, the temperature rose and fell like a slow tide. And with each shift, the glaciers advanced or retreated, reshaping the land and the lives that depended on it. To understand this world, it isn't enough to picture a planet buried in snow. We have to see how that snow moved, how the cold deepened and then eased, and how these long, quiet changes wrote the story of the Ice Age. At the heart of this rhythm were cycles we can still trace today. Scientists call them Milankovitch cycles, after the mathematician who first calculated their patterns. They are driven by the way the Earth moves around the Sun,
not in a perfect circle, but in a long, slow dance that changes over tens of thousands of years. The shape of our orbit stretches and relaxes. The tilt of the Earth's axis leans a little more than a little less. Even the planet's gentle wobble, like a spinning top losing speed, shifts the way sunlight reaches different parts of the world. Each of these movements happens too slowly for any single generation to notice, but together they change everything. When the tilt is smaller, summers in the northern hemisphere are cooler. Snow that falls in winter lingers longer into the next year, and the ice grows. When the tilt increases, the summers grow warmer and stronger, melting more snow, and the ice retreats. It is a balance, subtle and relentless, turning the planet from cold to less cold and back again, across vast stretches of time. Yet these orbital changes alone cannot explain the full force of the Ice Age. The Earth's climate is a web of feedbacks, where one small shift triggers another. When glaciers expand, they reflect more sunlight into space, which cools the planet even further. The colder it gets, the more the oceans draw down carbon dioxide, locking it away and lowering greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. That drop in carbon dioxide cools the world even more, helping the ice spread farther. It is a chain reaction that takes millennia to build and even longer to reverse. But the cycle works both ways. When the Earth begins to warm, the opposite happens. Ice melts, exposing dark land and open water, which absorb more heat. The oceans release carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, trapping more warmth. The feedback loop reverses, and the glaciers retreat. The planet does not simply fall into an ice age or escape from it. It moves back and forth between these states like a pendulum, steady in its swing, but immense in its scale. Even within these grand cycles, there were smaller jolts, sudden pulses of cold or warmth that rippled across the Ice Age world. Some came from the oceans, as vast currents shifted their paths, redistributing heat between the equator and the poles. Others were triggered by massive volcanic eruptions, sending ash and sulfur into the sky and dimming the sun for years at a time. And at the edges of the great ice sheets, immense lakes sometimes formed behind walls of frozen water. When those icy barriers collapsed, they unleashed floods so vast that they rewrote coastlines and may have shifted the climate for centuries. To live through these changes was to see the world tilt slowly out of balance and then settle again. For the animals that roamed the steppe and the forests, it meant following the land as it changed. Herds of mammoth and bison would push south when the cold bit deep, only to spread north again when the ice withdrew. Predators followed their prey. Early humans, small bands of hunters and gatherers, learned to read these patterns in the land, moving with the seasons and the shifting borders of the cold. The glaciers themselves recorded these swings in silent detail. Every layer of ice holds tiny bubbles of ancient air, trapped as snow fell and pressed down year after year. When scientists drill deep into those layers, they can see the planet breathing. They find the fingerprints of every advance and retreat, every sharp drop or sudden rise in temperature. In that frozen archive, the history of the Ice Age is still waiting, stacked one winter atop another, a library of deep time. It is one thing to read about this rhythm, and another to imagine it.
Picture standing on a wide, cold plain, the sky pale and the wind sharp. Far to the north, a wall of ice looms like a mountain range. For centuries it has been creeping forward, mile by mile, a slow invasion no one alive can see. Then, after thousands of years, the air warms, the summers lengthen. The edge of the glacier begins to pull back. Water streams from beneath it, carving new rivers. The land once buried in ice lies bare, raw, and open to the sun for the first time in ages. And then, in time, the cold returns, and the long march of the ice begins again. This was the breath of the Ice Age, slow, steady, and powerful enough to shape continents. It was not a single freeze or a single thaw, but a vast and patient cycle, one that pushed life to its limits and then pulled it back again. In that long back and forth, animals evolved, humans adapted, and the Earth became the world we still recognize, even though so much of it has vanished beneath the warmth of the present day. Yet the story of the Ice Age is not only about cold and warmth. It is about the living world that took shape in that frozen light. Because while the climate set the stage, it was life itself, strange, massive, and resilient, that gave the Ice Age its character. The living world. Beneath the endless cold and the sweeping plains of ice, life endured. It didn't merely wait for the warmth to return. It adapted, evolved, and carved out a place for itself in one of the harshest environments the Earth has ever known. To survive in the chill was not simply a matter of endurance. It required transformation. From the smallest insect hiding beneath the snow to the largest beasts roaming the frozen steppe. The ground during the Ice Age was not lifeless. Just beneath the snow lay a hidden world, one built in miniature. In the tundra soils, rodents dug networks of burrows, their tiny bodies shielded by layers of earth and frost. Lemmings, voles, and other small mammals were the base of the food chain, their survival making possible the lives of countless predators above. These creatures did not hibernate entirely. Many stayed active beneath the snowpack.
They
Their
tore away
movements,
forests,
carving
crushed
tunnels
hills,
invisible
and
from the
ground
surface.
rock into fine
Down
powder.
there, the
Beneath
air was
their
still,
weight, the crust
temperature
of the
stable,
planet
and the
itself
snow
bent
overhead
downward,
acted as
sinking
insulation
slightly
against the
under
worst
the
of the
load.
wind.
When the ice
Above
later
them,
retreated,
the larger
land
animals
rose
moved
again,
across the
a
landscape
slow
with heavy,
rebound that
deliberate
continues
steps.
even now
The
in
woolly
parts of
mammoths
Canada
wrapped
and
in coats of
Scandinavia.
long, coarse
The
hair
movement
with
of
a
the
dense
ice
underlayer
left
of
behind
insulating wool
landscapes
could
that are
withstand
still
temperatures
easy
that
to
would freeze
recognize.
exposed skin in
Deep
minutes.
valleys with flat
Their
bottoms
blood carried
and steep
special
walls
adaptations,
carved by the
allowing it to
relentless
release
pressure
oxygen,
of moving
even in the
glaciers
coldest parts
can
of
be
their
found
bodies,
across the
keeping their
northern
limbs from
world.
stiffening.
Great boulders
Muskoxen
carried for
thick
hundreds
pelts,
of miles
so effective
and dropped far
that
from
snow
their
could
source,
settle on their
sit
backs
scattered
without
across
melting,
open fields,
a sign that almost
silent
no
witnesses
heat escaped.
to the journeys they once
Predators
made,
were no less
trapped
prepared.
in the ice.
The dire
And then
wolves and
there are the
saber-toothed
lakes.
cats were built for
Thousands
strength
of them,
and stamina,
filling the
with
basins
powerful
gouged
muscles
out by
to bring
glaciers.
down prey in
The
deep
Great
snow.
Lakes of North
Their
America
coats were
are
thick,
perhaps the
and their
most
paws
famous
broad
example.
enough to keep them from
Vast
sinking into
bodies
the
of
frozen
water
ground
resting
as
in
they
the
stalked their
scars
quarry.
left by the retreating
Even
Laurentide
the great
ice sheet.
cave lions,
The
some of the
glaciers
largest
were not
cats
merely
the world has ever
sculptors of
seen,
land.
were shaped
They
by
also
the
shaped
cold.
the waters of
Leaner
the world.
than their modern relatives,
As the ice grew,
but with limbs
sea
built
levels
for the
dropped,
endless pursuit
exposing
of Ice
vast
Age prey
coastal
across
plains.
open ground.
When the ice melted,
The plants that
the
fed this
seas rose
frozen world
again,
were equally
drowning
remarkable.
those same
At
plains
first glance,
beneath the waves.
Ice Age landscape
the
might
land
seem
bridges
barren,
that once
but just
connected
beneath the snow
continents,
and in
like
the brief
one
summers,
that linked Asia
hardy
to North
vegetation
America,
flourished.
existed only
Grasses
because so much of the
dominated
planet's
mammoth
water
steppe,
was locked
covering
up in
vast
ice.
areas from Europe to
Each
North America.
shift of the glaciers
These grasses
rewrote the
were
map
rich
of
in
the
nutrients,
Earth.
perfectly
Yet for all
suited
their
for grazing
power,
herds
the
that
glaciers
needed to eat
moved
nearly
slowly.
constantly to survive
a
the
few feet
cold.
a day was all it took
Mixed
for their
among them
weight
were
to
tough
change the
shrubs
face
and
of a
dwarf
continent.
willows, their
To
branches
stand
hugging
before
close to
one
the ground,
was to look at a
safe from
force
the
that
relentless
felt
wind.
eternal.
These
Even
plants
though
had
it was
evolved to
always in
withstand long
motion.
periods of darkness
You could hear
and
it
grief,
sometimes,
but
the
intense
sharp
seasons
cracks
of
of
growth,
shifting ice,
responding
the low
quickly to the
groan
short
of
window of
frozen
summer
mass
sunlight.
pressing against the
Even
land.
insects found a
When
way to
meltwater
endure.
pooled and then
Some
broke
produced
free,
natural
it surged
antifreeze within
across
their
the
bodies,
earth in floods
proteins
so
that kept
massive
their cells
they
from
carved
freezing
new
solid.
channels in a matter of
Others
days.
laid eggs that could
These were not
survive the
gentle
winter
rivers.
untouched,
They
waiting
tore
for
at
the
the
brief
land
warmth
with a
of summer
strength
to
born of
awaken the next
centuries of
generation.
trapped water
Birds
suddenly
adapted too.
unleashed.
Many
And
species
in their
migrated
wake,
south,
they left
but some
behind
stayed,
something
their feathers
unexpected.
dense, their
For all their
metabolisms burning
destruction,
hot enough to endure
glaciers
the deep
also
cold.
created new
The
opportunities
snowy
for
owl,
life.
for example,
When they
patrolled the
retreated,
tundra
they
year-round,
revealed fresh
feeding on
ground,
lemmings and
stripped
thriving in a
clean
world
and
that
rich
few
with
others
mineral
could
dust.
tolerate.
Plants
Humans,
were quick
though
to
fragile
colonize
by
these bare
comparison,
landscapes,
were not without their
sending
own
roots
strategies.
into the raw earth.
Early hunters and
In
gatherers
time,
relied on
animals
ingenuity
followed,
as much as
and
strength.
in their footsteps
They
came the
fashioned
first
clothing from
human
furs,
hunters,
stitched
tracking
tightly
the
to
herds
trap
into the
heat.
lands the
They
glaciers
built
had
shelters from
uncovered.
bone and hide,
These
using
frozen
mammoth ribs as
sculptures
frames
also
for
carried
tents covered in
stories in
thick
their
layers of
layers.
animal skin.
Within the ice itself,
Fire was their greatest
scientists
ally,
have found traces
not only
of
for
ancient
warmth,
air,
but for
ash
survival
from
itself,
distant volcanic
allowing
eruptions,
them to cook food,
and even
harden
pollen
tools,
from plants
and
that
push
grew
back
long
against
ago.
the deep,
Each
unrelenting
layer
dark.
is a record,
For these
a
small
page
bands
in the
of people,
frozen history
life
of
was
the
a
earth,
constant negotiation
telling us not
with
only
the
how
cold.
the ice shaped the
Every
land,
step into the snow
but how
carried
it breathed
risk.
in rhythm with the
Frostbite,
climate.
hunger, and
To the
predators
creatures
were a
that lived
daily
through
threat.
it, though, the
Yet they learned
glaciers
to
were not
move with the
history.
seasons,
They were
following the
boundaries,
herds as they
massive
migrated,
and unmoving.
using rivers and
To a mammoth
coastlines
or
as
a bison,
landmarks across
a
the
glacier's
endless white.
edge was the end of the
They
world.
made weapons from stone
wall
and
that
bone,
could not be
sharp enough to
crossed.
pierce the thick
Even
hides
humans,
of the beasts
clever
they hunted.
and determined,
And over
could
time,
only move
their
along
knowledge
its
of
borders,
this frozen world
following
deepened,
rivers and valleys
until they
where
could
the
live
ice
not
had
in
not yet
spite of the
claimed
cold,
the ground.
but because they understood
And as
it.
the ice sheets grew
What made
and
this
shrank,
hidden web of
with the
life
slow
remarkable
pulse of
was
the
its
planet,
balance.
they drew
The
the
snow
map
did not
of the
simply
world we
bury
know
the
now.
world, it shaped it.
Every rolling
Beneath
hill
its
in
weight,
northern Europe,
species learned
every
to bend
scattered
without
lake
breaking.
across Canada,
Each adaptation,
every stretch
from the
of
smallest
rich
bull's
soil in the
tunnel to the
American
mammoth's
Midwest,
insulating coat,
all of it
was a
bears the
response
mark
to
of
an
the
environment
glaciers.
that demanded
These were not just
everything
masses
and
of
gave
frozen
little in
water.
return.
They were the chisels
But this world
that
was not
carved
only
the
about
earth itself.
survival, it was
But as they
also
carved,
about transformation.
they also changed the
With
seas.
every swing of the
When
climate,
so much
with
water was
every
locked
advance
away
or
in their
retreat of the
frozen
glaciers,
weight, the
life
oceans
shifted.
fell.
Species that
coastline
thrived in the
stretched
cold
outward,
sometimes
and new
vanished when
lands
the world
emerged
warmed.
from beneath
Others
the waves.
emerged, stepping
And it
into
was
the
in
niches
those
left
newly
behind.
exposed places
The Ice Age
that
was
life,
not a frozen
animal,
prison.
human,
It was a
and
crucible,
otherwise,
and
would
from it
find
came creatures and
unexpected
behaviors
paths forward.
that still echo in the
When the
living
great
world
ice
today.
sheets swelled and
Even
locked up
now,
so
in the
much
tundras of
planet's
Siberia
water,
or the
oceans
Arctic
drew
Circle,
back
you can
like a
see
tide
fragments
that
of
would
that
not return
ancient
for
survival
thousands of
strategy.
years.
The muskox
Shorelines
still
stretched
stands
outward,
broad and
exposing
immovable against the
vast
wind.
plains that had been
Arctic
hidden beneath
foxes
the waves
still
for
change
ages.
their coats from brown
Rivers
to
carved
white
new
with the
paths
seasons,
across this
vanishing
uncovered
into the
ground,
snow like
and
ghosts.
entire continents
These
gained
living
new
remnants are
edges.
reminders that the
world
Ice Age
looked
did not
different then,
end cleanly.
familiar in its
It left
shape,
pieces of
but
itself
altered in
scattered
ways that
across the
seem
earth,
almost
pieces
impossible
that
to
still
imagine
endure.
now.
And as
At
the
the height of the
glaciers
Ice
breathed
Age,
in and
sea
out,
level dropped
as the
by more
cold
than
deepened and
100
eased,
meters.
this hidden world
This was
beneath
not
the
a
snow
sudden
never
plunge,
stopped
but a
changing.
slow withdrawal,
What lay ahead was a
paced by the
planet still
relentless
in
growth
motion,
of the glaciers.
one where ice would
What had
carve
once
the
been
land in
shallow
ways
coastal
that
waters
reshaped the
became
very bones of the
windswept
earth.
grasslands.
The ice
Bays
was
and
never
inlets
still.
turned to
It
dry
moved with a
valleys,
force so
islands
vast and
connected to mainlands,
unrelenting that it
and land
reshaped
bridges
entire
appeared between
continents.
that
When we
today
imagine
are divided
glaciers,
by
we
open
often
sea.
picture silent
The
walls
most
of
famous
frozen
of these
white.
was Beringia,
But these great
the
ice
stretch of
sheets were
land
not
that once
static
connected
monuments.
Asia
They were
and North
engines
America.
of change,
It
grinding,
was no narrow
crushing,
strip,
and
but a
carving the land
enormous
beneath them
expanse of
with the
tundra
patience
and
only the
steppe,
earth itself
hundreds
can
of
keep.
miles wide,
The
dotted
largest
with
of them
rivers,
blanketed
and home
much
to
of the northern
mammoths,
world.
bison,
In
and
North
the
America,
first humans
the
who would one
Laurentide
day
ice sheet
cross into a
stretched from
new
the high
world.
Arctic
To
down
those
to what
who
is now
walked
the
it,
middle of the
it
United
wasn't
States.
a bridge at all.
It was so
was a
thick in
landscape,
places
a
that its
country of
surface
its own,
rose higher than the
rich with
tallest
life
mountains.
and as real as any
Across
other
the
part of
Atlantic,
the earth.
the Fennoscandian
Farther
ice sheet
south,
covered
the Thunder
Scandinavia
Shelf joined
and pushed
the islands
deep
of
into northern
Southeast
Europe,
Asia to the mainland,
its edge slowly
creating a
grinding
vast
forward like a
continuous
tide of
landmass.
frozen stone.
Australia,
Even
New
in the
Guinea, and
southern
Tasmania
hemisphere,
merged
smaller
into
ice
a
sheets
single
covered the
connected
highlands of South
continent.
America, New
Across
Zealand,
Europe,
and parts
the
of
North Sea
Antarctica
floor
that
was
reached farther
exposed,
than they do
forming
today.
a region known today
These sheets
as
of ice were
Doggerland,
not gentle.
a broad
As they
plain that
advanced,
stretched
they
between
scraped
Britain
the
and the
earth
rest of
bare,
the continent, crisscrossed by rivers and dotted with low hills. These new lands didn't just change geography, they changed the course of life itself. Animals followed the expanding frontiers, migrating into places where the sea had once barred their way. Humans did the same, tracking game across these new pathways, slowly spreading across the globe in ways that would shape the future of our species. But this transformation was not limited to land alone. The retreat of the oceans reshaped the coast that remained. Beaches stretched outward for miles, estuaries shrank, and coral reefs were left high and dry, bleaching and dying as the water abandoned them. The world's oceans grew colder and saltier, their currents shifting in response to the changing balance of water and ice. These changes in turn fed back into the climate, helping to hold the Earth in its frozen state. Even the air above the seas changed. As the oceans drew back, vast stretches of exposed continental shelf became sources of dust, swept up by strong ice age winds and carried for thousands of miles. This dust settled over the land, creating the thick, fertile layers that would later nourish some of the richest farmlands on Earth. It was another reminder that the Ice Age was not only an age of loss, but an age of preparation, laying the groundwork for the world that would come after the thaw. For those who lived through it, though, these changes would not have been obvious. The sea did not vanish overnight.
A hunter could walk the same path his parents had walked, never realizing that far to the east or west, the tide was creeping away year after year. It was only in the scale of generations that the transformation revealed itself. Rivers flowing where there had once been bays, herds grazing on ground that had been ocean floor, and new horizons opening to the daring few who followed them. And while the ocean stood still, life adapted. Coasts became hunting grounds. River mouths turned into rich feeding places for migrating birds and fish. Humans learned to use these changes to their advantage, following the trails of the animals that now roamed across these exposed plains. In every corner of the Ice Age world, the receding waters revealed not just land, but opportunity. Yet, like the glaciers themselves, the oceans would not remain fixed forever. As the climate warmed, the ice would begin to retreat, and the seas would creep back in, drowning the lands they had left bare. Doggerland would sink beneath the North Sea, Beringia would vanish beneath the waters of the Bering Strait, and the coastlines of the world would draw back to something closer to the shape we know today. But that part of the story was still far off. For now, in the heart of the Ice Age, the oceans had paused. The planet stood in its frozen state, locked in a balance of ice and sea that held the world steady for thousands upon thousands of years. It was in this frozen balance that the great winds began to rise and carry their burden of dust across the sky, marking the next great force that shaped this ancient world. The cold alone did not define the Ice Age. Alongside the glaciers and the low seas came a sky heavy with dust and winds that never seemed to rest. The atmosphere during this time was not the clear, crisp air we might imagine when we picture a frozen world. It was filled with fine particles carried across continents, turning the sun hazy and painting the sky in pale, muted tones. This dust came from the land the ice left behind. When glaciers advanced, they ground the rock beneath them into powder. As the ice pulled back or stalled at its edges, the wind swept across these barren plains, lifting the finest particles into the air and driving them for hundreds, even thousands of miles. Each storm added more, spreading a blanket of dust that settled far from its source. In many regions, these layers still remain. Loose deposits, as scientists call them, stretch across China, parts of Europe, and North America. They are hundreds of feet thick in some places, built up grain by grain from the winds of the Ice Age. Over time, these dusty plains would become some of the most fertile soils on Earth. But during the Ice Age itself, they were part of an endling cycle: wind, dust, and the relentless cold. The weather that carried this dust was harsh and unpredictable. Vast temperature differences between the frozen north and the slightly warmer south drove powerful winds. These winds scoured the land, flattening snow into hard-packed sheets and sweeping away what little warmth there was to be found. They carried not only dust but snow, piling it high in drifts that could swallow entire landscapes. Yet the Ice Age atmosphere was not only a world of wind and dust, it was a world of extremes. Winters were long and bitter, with temperatures plunging far below anything most of us could imagine. Summers, though short, could be surprisingly warm in some regions, especially on the great grasslands where the sun had little competition from clouds. This sharp contrast between seasons created an environment where life had to be endlessly adaptable, able to endure deep freezes and then burst into motion during the brief windows of growth and abundance. Volcanoes added their own chaos to this already strange sky. Massive eruptions sent ash into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight and deepening the cold for years at a time. In some layers of ice cores, scientists have found traces of these ancient eruptions, fingerprints of moments when the sky itself grew darker and the glacier seized the opportunity to press even farther. Even the very air was different. The levels of carbon dioxide during the Ice Age were far lower than they are today. The thinness of that greenhouse blanket made the atmosphere colder and drier, especially near the great ice sheets. In these regions, snow fell rarely, not because the cold prevented it, but because there was so little moisture in the air. Paradoxically, the frozen heart of the Ice Age world was often a desert of snow and wind, its surface scoured rather than buried beneath fresh flakes. For the animals that lived in this world, weather was not a passing concern. It was a force that shaped their every move. Herds of mammoth and bison followed the shifting winds to find areas where snow had been blown away, exposing the grass beneath. Predators trailed them, their survival dependent on these same patterns. Even early humans learned to read the signs in the sky, watching the winds and clouds to understand when the weather might shift and when the cold would deepen. Dust, too, carried its own consequences. While it dulled the sky and coated the ground, it also fed life. Winds dropped nutrients across the plains, scattering minerals that made the Ice Age grasslands unexpectedly rich. This strange balance, an atmosphere full of dust and wind, and yet a land that could still feed countless herds, was one of the quiet paradoxes of the Ice Age world. Imagine standing on one of those windswept plains. The horizon is wide and pale, the air is sharp, the wind never quite stopping. In the distance, a haze hangs low, a thin veil of dust stirred up by storms far away. Above it all, the sun glows weakly, its warmth reaching the ground, but never enough to chase away the bite of the air. In that moment, you could feel what it was like to live beneath an Ice Age sky, harsh, restless, and yet strangely full of life. This atmosphere, with all its dust and sweeping winds, was not just a backdrop. It was a force that helped shape the planet and its living things. And as the air moved, it carried with it the seeds of the world that lay beneath. The grasslands that stretched from horizon to horizon and gave the Ice Age its most defining feature, the endless frozen steppe, where giants roamed and survival played out on a scale as vast as the land itself. The Mammoth Steppe. Stretching from Western Europe across Siberia and over to North America, there was a land unlike anything we see today. It was neither frozen tundra nor dense forest, but something in between. A vast windswept grassland that supported some of the greatest gatherings of animal life in Earth's history. Scientists call it the Mammoth Steppe, and it was the beating heart of the Ice Age world. The Mammoth Steppe was enormous, larger than any single biome on Earth today. Its cold, dry air and short summers might sound harsh, but this grassland was astonishingly productive. Thick mats of tough grasses and herbs blanketed the ground, adapted perfectly to the brief season of growth. These plants did not waste energy reaching for the sky like trees.
Instead, they stayed low, clinging close to the ground where the wind couldn't strip away their warmth, where they could hold fast in the thin, dusty soil left behind by the glaciers. It was this abundance of grass that allowed the giants to thrive. Herds of woolly mammoths roamed the steppe in great numbers, their tusks sweeping low as they dug through snow to reach the food beneath. Steppe bison grazed in endless lines, their heavy coats rippling in the wind. Wild horses, smaller and stockier than the ones we know today, galloped across the open plains in tightly knit herds. And mingling among them were the woolly rhinoceroses. Enormous, broad-shouldered animals with thick horns that they used to push through snow or defend themselves against predators bold enough to approach. The predators of the mammoth steppe were no less formidable. Packs of dire wolves followed the herds, their larger size and powerful jaws giving them the strength to bring down even the toughest prey. Cave lions, nearly twice the size of modern lions, hunted in coordinated groups, stalking the fringes of the grasslands. And then there were the saber-toothed cats, ambush hunters that waited for the perfect moment to strike, their curved fangs designed to pierce deep and fast. But it was not only the great beasts that lived here. Smaller creatures filled every niche. Lemmings and ground squirrels burrowed beneath the earth, their tunnels crisscrossing the frozen soil like an invisible web. Arctic foxes darted across the steppe, scavenging from kills left by the larger predators or hunting the rodents that lived just below their feet. Even ravens and vultures circled overhead, waiting for a chance to descend when the snow was marked red by a fresh kill. And then there were the humans. They came late to this land compared to the other inhabitants, but when they arrived, they became part of it. Early hunters followed the herds across the open plains, tracking mammoths and bison, learning their patterns and testing their skills against the vastness of this frozen wilderness. They built shelters from mammoth bones covered with hides to keep out the wind, and they painted the creatures they hunted on the walls of caves, their images a record of both admiration and survival. What made the mammoth steppe so unique was not just its size, but its stability. For thousands of years, it remained a world apart, shaped by the cold, but also sheltered from it. The grasses endured the winters, lying dormant beneath the snow, only to explode back to life in the summer sun. This cycle of freezing and renewal sustained a web of life that was astonishingly resilient. Even as glaciers advanced and retreated at the steppe's edges, the richness of this land can still be glimpsed today. In Siberia, frozen in the permafrost, are the remains of mammoths so well preserved that their fur still clings to their hides, their stomachs still holding the grasses they once ate. These silent relics tell us what kind of world this was, a place where life was abundant, even in the shadow of the ice, where the ground was hard, the air dry, and yet there was enough to feed giants. Standing in the middle of it would have been overwhelming. The horizon would stretch in every direction, unbroken by forests or mountains. The wind would sweep across the plains, carrying the low sounds of distant herds and the calls of predators on the hunt. Every creature, from the smallest rodent to the largest mammoth, was part of a single interwoven system, one that turned grass and dust into flesh and bone, on a scale almost too large to grasp. But this world, for all its size and endurance, was not eternal. It depended on the cold to keep its balance. When the climate shifted, when the ice began to retreat and forests crept northward, the steppe began to shrink. Its great herds were pushed into smaller and smaller refuges, until eventually the grassland of giants became a memory, preserved only in fossils and frozen bones. Before that day came, though, the mammoth steppe stood as one of the greatest natural stages Earth had ever known.
It was here that humans honed their survival skills. It was here that the last great ice-aged beasts ruled. And it was here, in this cold and dusty grassland, that life learned to endure in ways that would echo long after the steppe itself was gone. From this vast plain, our journey moves toward the people who walked it, not just as wanderers, but as survivors who faced a world of ice and wind and found a way to call it home. Across the Mammoth Steppe and along the edges of the ice, small bands of humans moved with the seasons. They were not yet masters of this frozen world, but they were learning. In a land ruled by bitter winds and towering beasts, survival meant more than strength. It demanded knowledge, skill, and above all, the ability to adapt. Life for these early humans was shaped entirely by the cold. They built their shelters low against the wind, using whatever materials the land offered. In treeless regions where wood was scarce, they turned to the bones of mammoths. Rib bones, tusks, and skulls were stacked into frames and covered with hides, creating huts that could keep out even the harshest winter air. Inside, the space was cramped but warm, lit by the glow of a single vital force: fire. Fire was more than a tool. It was a boundary between survival and death. Around its light, families gathered close, their furs pulled tight, their hands outstretched toward the warmth. It cooked their food, hardened their weapons, and gave them protection against the endless dark of Ice Age nights. A single flame could mean safety in a world where the cold waited just beyond the walls, patient and unforgiving. But fire alone was not enough. Humans learned to shape stone into blades, scrapers, and spear points, sharp enough to pierce the hides of mammoths and bison. They crafted tools from bone and antler, each one designed with precision born from necessity. Hunting in this world was no simple act. It required cooperation. Small groups worked together to track their prey across open ground, driving it into ambushes or toward waiting hunters armed with spears. A single successful hunt could feed many mouths, but a failed one could mean days of hunger. Even in the cold, they found ways to create. In caves and shelters scattered across Europe and Asia, they left behind paintings and carvings. Mammoths, bison, horses, and reindeer lined the walls, drawn with care and attention to detail that suggest deep familiarity with their subjects. These were not only decorations. They may have been a way to teach, to remember, or even to hope. Proof that even in a world where every day was a fight to endure, there was still room for something more than survival. Clothing, too, became a form of adaptation. Early humans stitched furs together with bone needles, layering garments until the cold could no longer cut through. Boots lined with grass and hide kept their feet from freezing on the icy ground. Each piece of clothing was shaped by experience, refined over generations of trial and error until they could face the wind and snow and keep moving. The cold demanded this kind of relentless ingenuity. Every tool, every shelter, every firelit gathering was an answer to the same question: how do we live here? And slowly humans learned to thrive where the unprepared would have perished. They watched the animals, studying their migrations and the way they used the land. They followed the herds to fresh grazing grounds, drank from rivers carved by melting glaciers, and mapped the world not with ink or symbols, but with memory. In the long nights, they told stories. Around the fire while the wind howled beyond their walls of bone and hide. Voices carried through the darkness. They spoke of hunts, of dangers faced, and of the strange, immense world around them. Those stories were more than comfort. They were a way of passing down knowledge, of teaching the next generation how to survive in a land where one mistake could be fatal. Yet even in this unforgiving world, there were moments of quiet connection. A fire crackling in the darkness, a child curled against their mother, warm beneath layers of fur, the soft hum of voices blending with the sound of the wind outside. In those moments, the Ice Age was not only a test of endurance, it was also a place where humans began to shape themselves into the adaptable, resilient creatures they would one day become. They were not alone in this frozen world. Other humans, like the Neanderthals, shared the same harsh landscape for a time. They too mastered the cold, building their own shelters and hunting the same herds. Some groups may have exchanged tools
or even joined together, leaving traces of interwoven lives that still echo in our DNA. In the deep past, under the pale light of an Ice Age sun, the boundaries between survival and innovation began to blur, and humanity's future was slowly written in firelight and shadow. These were not the bustling cities or great civilizations of later ages. These were small clusters of people bound by necessity, shaped by the land they walked. Every step, every choice, every spark of fire they lit in the snow was part of a slow march forward, a quiet determination to live in a world that seemed designed to push them back. And as the fires burned against the dark, the cold outside never truly relented. The ice still loomed on the horizon. The winds still carried their dust across the plains. But within those fragile circles of warmth, humans endured. And in enduring, they began to change the world in ways that would outlast the Ice Age itself. The cold would not break them. It would forge them, and in that forging, they would take the first steps toward everything that came after. In the glow of their fires, with the wind pressing at the walls of their shelters, humans began to do more than endure. They learned to shape the world with their hands. Every tool they chipped from stone, every line they drew on a cave wall, was another step toward mastering the Ice Age rather than merely surviving it.
Stone was their most faithful resource. From riverbeds and cliffs they gathered flint and chert, breaking them apart with deliberate strikes to create sharp, cutting edges. The first tools were simple flakes for scraping hides or cutting meat, but over generations they became more refined. Hunters learned to craft long, narrow blades that could be fixed to spears, turning them into weapons that could bring down the largest animals of the steppe. They shaped bone and antler into barbed points and hooks, tools designed for precision rather than brute force. These weapons were more than instruments of survival. They were proof of a growing ability to think ahead, to imagine a solution before it was needed. But tools were not only for hunting. Scrapers smoothed hides into soft, workable leather for clothing. Awls pierced holes for stitching, allowing people to sew garments that fit tightly enough to block the wind. In a world where exposure could be deadly, the ability to make a well-sewn coat or pair of boots was as vital as any weapon. Alongside these practical tools came something unexpected: art. Deep inside caves far from the reach of the sun, humans left marks that would last for tens of thousands of years. They painted mammoths, bison, and horses, their outlines traced in ochre and charcoal. Some scenes were simple, others showed entire herds captured with such care that even today their muscles and movement seem alive. Handprints pressed against the walls still remain, as if the people who made them were reaching across time, leaving a sign that they had been there, that they had seen this world, and wanted it remembered. No one can say for certain why they did it. Perhaps these images were part of rituals, attempts to summon luck for the hunt or honor the animals they depended on. Perhaps they were lessons for the young, a way of teaching them to recognize the shapes and movements of the creatures they would one day track. Or perhaps they were simply expressions of something deeply human, the urge to create, even when the world outside was hard and cold. Carvings, too, appeared during this time. Small figures made from bone or ivory, some shaped like animals, others like humans. The most famous among them are the Venus figurines, rounded, stylized representations of the human form. Their purpose remains a mystery, but they speak of a mind that was not only concerned with food and shelter. These were the first sparks of imagination, proof that even in the shadow of the glaciers, humans carried within them a need to give shape to ideas. These same minds developed new ways to organize their lives. Hunters worked in coordinated groups, learning how to drive animals toward waiting spears. They tracked the movements of the herds, timing their migrations and mapping the land in memory. Around their fires, they shared knowledge: how to chip stone, how to stitch hides, how to choose the safest path across a river swollen with meltwater. Nothing was written, but nothing was lost either.
Each skill was passed from one generation to the next, a chain of survival stretching unbroken through the cold. Even the simple act of fire-making changed. Early humans learned not only how to keep a flame alive, but how to kindle it from nothing. With flint and pyrite, they struck sparks into dry tinder, coaxing embers until they bloomed into steady flames. Fire was no longer a lucky accident stolen from lightning or kept alive through sheer vigilance. It was theirs to make and control. And in that mastery lay the foundation of everything that followed. But it was art that revealed the truest transformation. In the flickering light of a torch, the walls of a cave became something more than bare stone. They became a stage for memory and meaning. Here, surrounded by the shapes of mammoths and bison drawn in deep red and black, people could look at their world not only as it was, but as they understood it. They were no longer just surviving in the Ice Age, they were beginning to define it. And in those quiet spaces, hidden from the wind and snow, the first hints of what would one day become human culture began to take form. The tools grew sharper, the shelters stronger, the art more intricate. Piece by piece, they were learning how to bend the cold to their will instead of being broken by it. Yet, even as humans learned to shape their world, they remained a small part of it. Beyond the edges of their fires and caves, the land still belonged to the great predators that stalked the steppe. And if people were to hold their fragile place in this frozen wilderness, they would have to live alongside those hunters, sharing the same ground and facing the same harsh, unrelenting world. The Ice Age was not only a world of herds and hunters with spears, it was also the domain of predators, creatures forged by the cold into perfect instruments of survival. To walk the frozen plains was to live with constant awareness that danger moved in the shadows, its presence as much a part of the landscape as the snow and wind. Among the most fearsome were the saber-toothed cats. Their long, curved fangs have become symbols of the Ice Age itself, blades of bone and enamel that could pierce deep into the flesh of their prey. These cats were not built for long chases. Their legs were powerful but short, their bodies stocky, their strength concentrated in the shoulders and neck. They were ambush predators, lurking in the low shrubs or along the edges of river valleys until an unsuspecting bison or young mammoth strayed too close. When they struck, it was fast and brutal, their fangs driving home before the prey even had time to run.
Yet, the saber-tooths were not the only hunters to fear. Cave lions, nearly twice the size of modern lions, prowled the mammoth steppe. Unlike the solitary saber-tooth, these great cats likely hunted in groups, their cooperation giving them an advantage over even the largest prey. Imagine a pack of them fanning out across the snow, their golden coats blending into the pale light, their paws moving silently over the frozen ground. Few animals could withstand a coordinated attack from predators of such size and strength. Then there were the dire wolves, heavier and more powerful than the wolves we know today. They roamed in packs, their numbers turning them into one of the deadliest forces of the Ice Age. They followed the herds for miles, wearing down their prey until exhaustion delivered the kill. For humans, these wolves were both rivals and warnings. The sound of their howls rolling across the steppe was a reminder that in this frozen world, hunters were never truly safe. Even the smaller predators held their own place in the hierarchy of fear. The wolverine, fierce and relentless, was a scavenger that could drive away animals many times its size. Foxes darted at the edges of hunts, stealing scraps whenever they could. Raptors circled overhead, waiting for the chance to descend upon the remains left behind by the great hunters of the ice. Humans did not exist outside this chain. They were part of it. When they ventured out from their shelters to hunt or scavenge, they risked crossing paths with these predators. A single misstep could turn the hunter into prey. This constant pressure forced people to be cautious, to travel in groups, to keep their fires burning bright at night as both warmth and warning. The glow of a campfire was a fragile barrier against the dark,
but it was enough to hold the shadows at bay. The relationship between humans and predators was not only one of fear, it was also one of competition and respect. When early hunters tracked a herd of bison, they sometimes found themselves following the same trail as a pack of dire wolves. When they scavenged the remains of a mammoth, they might arrive to find a saber-tooth already feeding. In these moments, survival was not only about strength, but about nerve, about knowing when to fight, when to retreat, and when to wait for the larger predator to finish and move on. Yet, in time, humans found ways to tip the balance. Spears gave them reach. Fire gave them a weapon that even the boldest predators hesitated to challenge. Slowly, they became more than just prey that fought back. They became rivals that could not be ignored. Still, this was not dominance. It was a truce of necessity, an uneasy coexistence on the vast open steppe where every living thing fought for the same few precious calories of meat and fat. Predators shaped the behavior of humans just as much as they shaped the herds. The need to watch, to stay alert, to plan every movement became part of life itself. And perhaps in the presence of saber-tooths and cave lions, humans learned something else: the value of cooperation. Alone, a person was vulnerable. Together, around their fires, armed with their tools and their voices, they stood a chance. The Ice Age was a world that never allowed anyone, beast or human, to forget what lurked beyond the reach of the firelight. The predators of the permafrost were a constant reminder that survival was never guaranteed. And yet, it was in this dangerous world that humans sharpened not only their spears, but their minds, becoming more than just one more animal moving across the steppe. As the great hunters prowled the snow, and the winds swept over the frozen plains, the stage was set for a struggle that would shape the very fate of the giants that ruled this land. A struggle that would decide which species would endure and which would fade into the long memory of the Ice Age. The Ice Age was a world of scale. Everywhere you turned, there was something larger, stranger, or more formidable than anything that walks the earth today. It wasn't only the mammoths or the saber-tooths. Across the continents, in every habitat shaped by the cold and wind, there were creatures that seemed almost mythical, a reminder that this was a wilder planet than the one we know now. On the open grasslands, the mammoth herds were only the beginning. Beside them roamed the woolly rhinoceroses, broad-shouldered and cloaked in dense fur, their long horns sweeping forward like natural spears. These animals were powerful enough to defend themselves against nearly any predator. And yet they shared the steppe with bison that stood taller than a man, wild horses with thick, stocky frames, and musk oxen built to survive the unrelenting cold. Farther south, where the ice gave way to open forests and temperate plains, other giants ruled. Mastodons wandered among the trees, stripping bark from trunks with their long, flexible trunks. They were distant relatives of the mammoth, smaller, but no less imposing. Ground sloths the size of small cars lumbered through the Americas, their massive claws digging into roots and tearing branches down from above. And in the same lands where these slow-moving herbivores roamed, predators followed. The short-faced bear, towering over any living bear today, stalked across the grasslands of North America. Its long legs carried it at speeds that would surprise any creature unfortunate enough to draw its attention. In Australia, the world was no less strange. There, giant kangaroos with powerful limbs shared the land with marsupial lions, predators unlike anything else on Earth. Enormous flightless birds heavier than ostriches stalked the open country, while reptiles far larger than their modern descendants lingered in rivers and swamps, their armored bodies and crushing jaws unchanged since deep time. Even the oceans carried their share of Ice Age wonders. Along the coasts, sea levels had fallen, exposing new hunting grounds for early humans and the predators of the sea alike. Marine mammals like the enormous stellar sea cow, a relative of the manatee, grazed on underwater meadows of kelp, while fearsome sharks still prowled the deeper waters. Life in the Ice Age was not simply land-bound.
It was a global network of giants. What made this world even more extraordinary was the sheer density of these animals.
the Mammoth steppe and the surrounding regions were among the most productive ecosystems the planet has ever seen, supporting vast numbers of herbivores and the predators that followed them. Food was never abundant by modern standards, but the cold, dry conditions produced grasslands that stretched nearly unbroken across continents, creating an unending stage for herds to roam and hunters to stalk. Humans lived among these creatures in a kind of precarious balance. To hunt a mammoth or a bison was to risk everything, but the rewards were too great to ignore. A single successful hunt could feed an entire band and provide bone and hide for tools and shelter. Yet, there was also danger in sharing the land with predators that could challenge humans for their kills or for their lives. To survive in this world of megafauna, humans became observers as much as hunters. They learned the habits of every creature they encountered. The way bison gathered before a storm, the trails mammoths followed to reach the best grazing grounds, the patterns of predators shadowing the herds. Each scrap of knowledge could mean the difference between life and death. And yet, for all its danger, this was a world of astonishing richness. Imagine standing on a ridge above the Ice Age plains. Before you stretches an ocean of grass and movement, mammoths pushing through the snow, bison kicking up clouds of frost, horses stamping and snorting in the cold air. In the distance, you see the dark shapes of predators following the herds with patient determination. Overhead, vultures circle, their sharp eyes fixed on the drama below. Everywhere the world is alive, immense and untamed. But this abundance was fragile. It was held together by the cold, by the vast reach of the glaciers and the steppe that surrounded them. As the climate shifted and the ice began to retreat, this world of giants would change. Forests would reclaim the plains, rivers would swell and redraw the land, and the creatures that once ruled the Ice Age would face a challenge they could not overcome. Before that change came, though, this wilder earth thrived. It was here, in the age of mammoths and saber-tooths and towering sloths, that humans sharpened their tools, their wits, and their determination. They did not merely live in the shadow of giants. They learned from them. And soon, as the ice began its long retreat, the relationship between humans and these massive creatures would shift in ways that would alter the course of the Ice Age forever. The Ice Age did not end with a single thaw. It was not a sudden collapse of cold or an overnight vanishing of the glaciers. Instead, it was a long, uneven retreat, a slow unraveling of the frozen grip that had held the world for tens of thousands of years. The Earth shifted in small increments, and each change carried consequences that reshaped the land, the seas, and the lives that depended on them. It began with warmth so subtle that it might have gone unnoticed. Summers grew slightly longer, and the snows that once lingered deep into the year began to melt more completely. The glaciers, those immense rivers of ice, felt the difference first. Their edges softened. Meltwater trickled across their surfaces, carving channels that grew wider and deeper with each passing season. What had once been silent and still now began to move with a new kind of urgency. These early meltwaters cut through the land like knives. Glacial rivers burst forth from beneath the ice, carrying silt and stone in their torrents, reshaping valleys and carving out new channels. Lakes formed where the ice blocked their path, only to drain in sudden catastrophic floods when those icy barriers finally gave way. Each flood tore across the land with an unstoppable force, leaving behind scars that would last for ages. As the glaciers withdrew, they revealed ground that had not seen sunlight in thousands of years. This raw land was barren at first, scraped clean by the grinding weight of the ice, but life wasted no time in reclaiming it. Mosses and lichens crept in first, clinging to the exposed rock. Then came the grasses, their roots sinking into the fresh soil carried by the winds. Slowly, the barren ground transformed into new ecosystems, green threads woven across the gray scars of the retreating ice. The animals followed. Herds of bison and mammoth moved into the freshly uncovered plains, grazing on the new growth. Predators shadowed them, filling the same ancient roles, but now in a changing landscape. Humans, too, pressed forward. They tracked the rivers, hunted along the edges of the shrinking glaciers, and stepped into regions that had been buried in ice for generations. But the retreat of the glaciers was not steady. There were pauses, even reversals. Periods of warming were followed by sharp, sudden returns of the cold. Moments when the ice surged forward once more, reclaiming the ground it had lost. These were brief compared to the long sweep of the Ice Age, but for the people and animals living through them, they were reminders that the Earth's great thaw was far from simple. One of the most dramatic of these reversals came in what we now call the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near glacial conditions, roughly 12,000 years ago. Just as the world seemed to be warming for good, the cold came rushing back, halting the retreat of the glaciers and plunging much of the planet into a final, unexpected freeze. For over 1,000 years, the advance of spring was delayed. The grasslands withered, and survival became once again a matter of endurance. And yet even that last gasp of the Ice Age eventually gave way. When the cold finally loosened its grip for good, the glaciers retreated faster than ever. The seas, fed by the meltwater of 1,000 rivers, began to rise. Lands vanished beneath the waves. Land bridges that had once carried humans and animals across continents were swallowed by the ocean. Beringia, that vast tundra that had linked Asia to North America, slipped beneath the waters of the Bering Strait. Doggerland, once a rich hunting ground between Britain and mainland Europe, was drowned by the North Sea. As the world warmed, forests began to creep northward, replacing the great grasslands of the Mammoth. Trees spread across Europe, Asia, and North America, transforming open plains into shadowed woodlands. Many of the Ice Age giants, creatures built for a world of cold and endless space, found themselves hemmed in by this changing landscape. Some adapted, many did not.
As the glaciers retreated and the climate stabilized, they discovered lands rich in rivers, fertile soil, and new resources. They followed the meltwaters, settled near the lakes and valleys carved by the ice, and began the long process of turning from wandering hunters into something different, the first settlers of a warming world. Yet even as they adapted to this new Earth, the glaciers remained a memory carved into the land. Their valleys became highways for rivers. Their deposits of silt and stone became the foundations of future farmlands. Their retreat marks not only the end of an age of cold, but the beginning of the world that would follow. The Ice Age was not over yet, but its strength was broken. The walls of ice that had once seemed eternal were fading, and in their place, new landscapes were emerging. The last great floods were still to come, and with them, the final transformation of the planet. As the glaciers weakened and the world warmed, the ice did not simply vanish. It fought its way out, melting in fits and starts, sometimes quietly, sometimes in catastrophic bursts. Beneath and within the shrinking sheets of ice, water gathered in vast hidden reservoirs, held back by walls of frozen mass that had stood for thousands of years.
When those walls failed, the earth itself seemed to roar. These were not ordinary floods. They were torrents so immense that they rewrote the land in a matter of days. In North America, one of the greatest examples of this lay beneath the Laurentide ice sheet. As it melted, a massive body of water known as Glacial Lake Agassiz formed, larger than all of the Great Lakes combined. For centuries, it remained trapped behind walls of ice and land. But ice is not permanent. When its barriers gave way, the lake exploded outward in a flood that would have been beyond anything the human eye could easily comprehend. Water surged across the land with unstoppable force. Entire valleys drowned in hours. Rivers that had been small and meandering were transformed into raging torrents miles wide. These floods carried boulders as easily as twigs, grinding the earth and scouring deep channels into the bedrock. They poured toward the oceans, raising sea levels, and in doing so, they altered the climate itself. Each flood was like a jolt to the planet's system, reshaping wind patterns and redistributing heat across the globe. This was not an isolated event. Around the edges of the melting glaciers, other hidden lakes lay waiting. Some broke free in violent bursts, sending walls of water crashing over the landscape. Others drained more slowly, their outflows carving new rivers that still exist today. The Columbia River Gorge in the Pacific Northwest, for instance, was partly shaped by a series of these glacial outbursts, floods so massive that they tore through the land again and again, leaving behind a landscape of cliffs and canyons as if carved by an ancient giant's hand. In Europe, similar forces were at work. As the ice withdrew, meltwater pooled in basins, forming lakes that eventually overflowed, changing the course of rivers and cutting new paths through the land. Even in Siberia, vast glacial lakes once covered what are now dry plains, their waters locked in place by walls of ice until they too broke and spilled away. For the people who lived in this shifting world, these floods must have felt both terrifying and transformative. Camps and hunting grounds near the shores of these lakes would have been swept away in an instant. Valleys that once teemed with game would vanish beneath rushing water. Yet in their wake, these floods also left behind new landscapes, fertile plains and waterways that would become lifelines for the generations that followed. Even the lakes that never burst played a role in reshaping the planet. Some remained trapped in the land for centuries after the glaciers retreated, their waters collecting in the deep scars carved by ice. Many of the Great Lakes we know today, Superior, Michigan, Huron, are the remnants of this time, their basins filled by meltwater as the last of the ice vanished. These lakes became more than just geological features. They were reservoirs of life, feeding the rivers and nourishing the plants and animals that would reclaim the once frozen world. But not all these lakes were permanent. Some were ghosts of the Ice Age, vanishing as quickly as they appeared, their waters draining away once the ice that held them back was gone. Others shrank into smaller forms, their massive shorelines left behind like faded memories etched into the earth. To the people of the time, these changes must have felt as if the world itself was shifting under their feet. One generation might grow up beside a vast lake, its distant shores barely visible. The next might find that same lake gone, replaced by open grassland or a new river running where none had been before. In the span of human memory, the land was alive, changing in ways that demanded constant adaptation. These floods and hidden lakes were not only endings, they were beginnings. They carried away the last remnants of the glacial world and carved out the landscapes of the present. They created the river valleys where future civilizations would one day rise. They left behind fertile plains enriched with the sediments of a vanished age. And in their rush and in their silence, they marked the final struggles of the Ice Age as it yielded to a warmer, greener earth. But even as the waters reshaped the land, another story was unfolding. the fate of the giants that had ruled this frozen world for so long. The Ice Age was melting away, and with it, many of the creatures that had defined it would soon follow. As the glaciers retreated and the world warmed, the great animals of the Ice Age faced a challenge they could not overcome. For tens of thousands of years, mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats had dominated their frozen world. They had adapted perfectly to a life built on cold winds and endless grassland. But the Ice Age was ending, and with it, the very foundation of their survival began to crumble. The first blow came from the changing climate. As the ice sheets melted, the mammoth steppe, the vast, dry grassland that had supported herds of enormous grazers, began to shrink. In its place, forests crept northward, their trees closing in on land that had once been open and boundless. For creatures built for the plains, this new world was suffocating. The grasses that had fed them disappeared beneath canopies of leaves, replaced by plants they were poorly suited to eat. Mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses could move only so far before the forest blocked their way.
Steppe bison and wild horses, once able to roam across continents, found their ranges cut into fragments. The predators that depended on these great herds, dire wolves, saber-toothed cats, and cave lions, saw their food supplies dwindle. Bit by bit, the intricate web of Ice Age life began to unravel. But climate alone was not the only force pressing on these giants. At the same time, humans were spreading into every corner of their world. With tools sharpened over thousands of years and the knowledge passed down through generations, hunters had become formidable. A single band of skilled humans armed with spears could bring down a mammoth. What once had been a rare and dangerous feat became more frequent, especially as populations grew and hunting methods became more sophisticated. Some researchers argue that it was not simply hunting that doomed the giants, but the combination of hunting and a warming climate. The great animals were already under pressure from shrinking habitats and dwindling food. When humans arrived, they pushed the balance past its breaking point. The evidence lies scattered across the earth. In Siberia, frozen mammoths lie buried in the permafrost, some with wounds that could only have come from human weapons. In North America, mammoth kill sites show clear signs of organized hunts, with bones cracked open for marrow and meat stripped clean. These were not isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern, one that played out wherever humans and megafauna met. And yet, even as many of these giants disappeared, some clung to survival. On a remote Arctic island called Wrangel, a small population of mammoths survived for thousands of years after their kin vanished from the mainland. They dwindled in size, becoming smaller, weaker versions of their ancestors, but they endured, cut off from the rest of the world by rising seas. Eventually, even they disappeared, but their long survival stands as a final echo of a vanished age. The extinction was not swift. It happened in waves, beginning in some regions while the giants still roamed in others. In Australia, many of the great marsupial beasts were gone long before the northern ice sheets had even begun to melt. In the Americas, mammoths and saber-tooths held on until the warming world and the spread of humans reached a tipping point. By the time the Ice Age finally yielded to the present climate, the great herds had thinned to nothing, leaving behind only bones and silence. This extinction winter reshaped the Earth as much as the melting glaciers. With the loss of the giants, entire ecosystems shifted. The grasslands that had once been kept open by herds of mammoths and bison gave way more quickly to forests. Predators that had relied on large prey either vanished or adapted to smaller targets.
And humans, no longer sharing the land with towering beasts, found themselves in a quieter, emptier world. Still, traces of that wild age remain. The muskox survives in the Arctic tundra, a living fragment of the steppe. Bison still roam in smaller herds, their ancestors having endured when so many others failed. Even the elephants of today carry echoes of the mammoths in their blood. But the giants who once defined the Ice Age exist now only in frozen remains, in scattered fossils, and in the faint memory of what the Earth once was. Their disappearance was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new one. With the glaciers gone and the great beasts fading, the world shifted once more, setting the stage for the rise of a planet that looked more and more like the one we now call home. When the last of the great beasts faded and the glaciers withdrew for the final time, the world began to change in ways that would have been unrecognizable to those who had lived through the height of the Ice Age. What had once been a frozen, windswept planet of ice and dust began to soften. The sharp edges carved by the glaciers gave way to gentler forms. Rivers swelled, forests advanced, and the earth began a slow transformation from white to green. The warming was not sudden, but its effects were everywhere. Vast sheets of ice that had dominated the northern continents for tens of thousands of years shrank back toward the poles. In their absence, valleys opened, plains stretched wide, and the scars left by the retreating glaciers filled with meltwater. These new lakes became anchors for life, their shores lined with the first green shoots of plants reclaiming the land. The grasses that had once stretched endlessly across the mammoth steppe began to give way to forests. Birch and pine came first, hardy pioneers able to grow in poor soil and cold conditions. Then came oak, elm, and other broadleaf trees, spreading northward as the climate stabilized. Within a few thousand years, regions that had once been treeless plains were transformed into dense woodlands. The open horizon of the Ice Age was replaced by a canopy of green. With the forest came new animals. Deer moved into the newly shaded lands, followed by wild boar and smaller grazers that thrived among the trees. Wolves, once hunters of the great herds, adapted to the forest, becoming stealthier and more specialized. Even humans changed with the land. No longer following the vast migrations of mammoths or bison, they learned to hunt the more elusive creatures of the woods, crafting bows and arrows to strike from a distance, and creating tools suited not to the steppe, but to the shaded world beneath the leaves. The rivers born from the melting ice carried nutrients into the lands, turning many of these regions into fertile corridors of life. Fish filled the streams and birds nested along the water's edge. Wetlands formed in the hollows left by retreating glaciers, attracting an explosion of life. Where once there had been a landscape of scarcity, there was now abundance. Even the oceans changed. As the glaciers released their water back into the seas, shorelines shifted inward. Coastal plains vanished beneath the waves, but in their place, new bays and estuaries were formed, teeming with marine life. Where the sea met the land, humans found some of their richest hunting grounds, gathering shellfish and fish along the coasts and adapting once again to a changing world. But this transformation was not only physical, it reshaped the rhythm of life itself. The Ice Age had been a world of extremes, with its endless winters and brief, frantic summers. Now, as the climate warmed, the seasons became more balanced. Spring stretched longer, summers grew milder, winters softened. The world was no less demanding, but its pace was gentler, its opportunities broader. This shift opened the door to something entirely new. For the first time,
humans began to stay in one place for longer periods. They gathered plants, hunted smaller game, and learned to read the cycles of the changing environment.
Slowly, tentatively, they began to shape the land, clearing patches of forest, scattering seeds and setting the first stones of a future where they would no longer only follow what nature gave, but begin to mold it themselves. The rebirth of the planet was not merely the end of the Ice Age, it was the foundation of the world we know. The forests that spread across Europe and Asia, the grasslands that remained in North America, the swelling rivers and new lakes, all of these became the backdrop for the rise of human society. From these green landscapes would come the first farms, the first villages, and eventually the first cities. Yet even in this greener earth, reminders of the Ice Age lingered. The Great Lakes, carved by glaciers, still dotted the continents. The wind still carried dust from the places where the ice had once ground rock into powder. In the far north, tundra and ice still clung to the edges of the world, a pale echo of the age that had passed. The planet had not simply recovered from the Ice Age, it had been remade by it. Every valley and river, every fertile plain, every forest that spread in the wake of the retreating glaciers was a legacy of that frozen era. From the scars of the ice came a world ready for something new, and humanity, no longer just a species of hunters on the steppe, was about to take its next step forward. But even as green spread over the land, the memory of the Ice Age did not fade. Its marks were written deep into the stones and soils of the earth, waiting for those who would one day learn how to read them. Even after the last of the great glaciers retreated and the world grew green, the Ice Age never truly vanished. Its traces remain all around us, etched into the surface of the earth and hidden deep within its layers. Every valley carved by ice, every boulder stranded far from its birthplace, and every band of sediment locked in stone is a quiet reminder of a world that once lay frozen beneath an endless sky of snow and wind. The most striking of these traces are the landforms themselves. Across North America and Europe, U-shaped valleys bear the unmistakable signature of glaciers. Unlike rivers, which carve narrow channels with winding paths, ice scours everything in its way, leaving behind broad, deep valleys with sheer walls and flat bottoms. These landscapes are the shadows of the ancient ice sheets, silent but undeniable proof of their slow, grinding power. Scattered across the plains, solitary boulders tell another part of the story. These glacial erratics, some as large as houses, were carried for hundreds of miles within the ice and left behind when the glaciers melted. They rest where no mountain could have formed them, standing like monuments to journeys that ended thousands of years before the first human cities were built. Lakes, too, are relics of the frozen past. The Great Lakes, the Finger Lakes, and countless smaller ones across the northern hemisphere were carved by the weight of the glaciers. When the ice retreated, these deep scars filled with meltwater, becoming the freshwater giants we know today. Every ripple of their surfaces is a remnant of an age when the world was locked in ice. But the most delicate whispers of the Ice Age are hidden in places we cannot see. Beneath Greenland and Antarctica, ancient layers of ice hold air bubbles trapped for hundreds of thousands of years. Scientists drill deep into these frozen archives, retrieving cores that read like the pages of a history book. Each layer preserves a moment in time, recording the atmosphere, the temperature, even the dust carried by long-vanished winds. From these frozen records, we have learned how the Ice Age began,
how it breathed in cycles of cold and warmth, and how it finally loosened its grip. In the rocks beneath our feet, there are other traces. Loess plains, vast deposits of wind-blown dust left behind during the Ice Age, stretch across China, Europe, and North America. These layers of fine, pale soil were carried by Ice Age winds and dropped in thick blankets that still feed the farmlands of today. Every harvest that grows from these soils is a quiet legacy of the glaciers that once scoured the land bare. Even the bones of the Ice Age remain, pulled from frozen ground and deep caves where they have slept for millennia. Perfectly preserved mammoths, their hair still intact, emerge from the Siberian permafrost. In North America, the bones of mastodons and giant sloths lie buried beneath peat bogs. In Europe, the skulls of cave lions and direwolves rest in caverns once lit by the fires of early humans. These remains aren't just fossils, they're direct connections to a world where cold and survival shaped everything. The stories written in stone and ice are not just about the past. They are a reminder of how deeply the Ice Age shaped the world we live in now. The fertile soils, the river valleys, the coastlines, all of these were sculpted in that frozen era. Even the distribution of plants and animals across the continents was set in motion by the slow advance and retreat of the glaciers. To walk through these places today is to stand in the footprint of that vanished world. A hiker tracing the rim of a glacial valley, a farmer turning the rich dust of an ancient loess plain, or a scientist holding a shard of mammoth tusk. All of them are touching the same story, a story written not in words, but in stone, water, and bone. But these traces are not just silent reminders of what once was. They are clues, pieces of a puzzle that we are still putting together. Every valley mapped, every core of ice drilled, and every fossil uncovered deepens our understanding not only of the Ice Age, but of the forces that still shape our planet today. And as we follow those whispers through stone and ice, we find that the past is not gone. It lives beneath our feet, hidden in the landscapes we see every day.
The Ice Age may have ended thousands of years ago, but its fingerprints are still everywhere. Every time we look at a map, every time we step outside and see the shape of a valley, the course of a river, or the outline of a coastline, we are looking at the legacy of that frozen past. The world we live in is not separate from the Ice Age. It is the world the Ice Age left behind. The most obvious echoes are in the land itself. The Great Lakes, carved out by the grinding weight of glaciers, still hold a fifth of the planet's fresh water. The smooth hills of New England and the plains of northern Europe are draped in glacial sediments, their soils made fertile by the dust and rock left behind as the ice retreated. Even the winding courses of many modern rivers were first traced by the torrent of meltwater that poured from the glaciers at the end of the Ice Age. In the far north, the Ice Age is not just history, it is still present. The tundra of Siberia, Alaska, and northern Canada remains frozen for much of the year. Its permafrost walking away the remains of a world that once was. In that frozen ground, the bones of mammoths still emerge along with traces of plants and even bacteria that have slept since the coldest days of the Pleistocene. Our atmosphere, too, still carries the marks of the Ice Age. The levels of carbon dioxide and the rhythms of Earth's climate were shaped in part by those frozen cycles. The patterns of ocean currents and wind, the very systems that carry storms and rains across the planet, were influenced by the way the glaciers sculpted the continents and shifted the weight of the Earth's crust. Even today, The planet still readjusts from the immense burden of ice that once pressed it down, the land rising millimeter by millimeter in a slow rebound that began thousands of years ago and has yet to finish. The legacy of the Ice Age is written in the lives of animals as well. Bison still roam the plains of North America, descendants of herds that grazed alongside mammoths. Musk oxen, shaggy and unyielding, remain on the Arctic tundra unchanged from their Ice Age ancestors. The reindeer and caribou that migrate across the north each year are following paths carved not only by instinct, but by a memory older than human history, one rooted in the age of ice and wind. Even within us, the echoes remain. The migrations of our ancestors were guided by the world of the Ice Age. Humans crossed land bridges exposed by low seas, followed the herds across the Mammoth steppe, and learned to survive in cold that would have killed the unprepared. The skills forged in that time, fire, tools, cooperation, didn't fade with the melting ice. They became the foundations of everything that followed. In the landscapes we farm, in the roots of our rivers, and the shape of our coastlines, in the animals that still walk the tundra, and in the bones buried beneath our feet, the Ice Age is never far away. It shaped the Earth, and in many ways, it shaped us. But perhaps the most striking echo of all is this. The Ice Age reminds us how quickly the world can change. Entire ecosystems came and went. Seas rose and fell. Giants walked the earth and vanished forever. And through it all, life adapted. It survived. It found new ways forward. The frozen world may be gone, but its story is not over. It continues in the ground beneath us, in the fossils we uncover, and in the landscapes that stretch around us. The Ice Age is not just a chapter of the past, it is the prologue of the present. And as we turn from these echoes toward the world we know now, we can finally step back and look at the full sweep of that frozen age. From its first creeping cold to its last lingering traces, if you could walk back into the Ice Age now, step by step, past the forests and rivers of the present and into that frozen world, the first thing you would notice would be the quiet. The wind would still move, and the snow would still fall, but there would be a deep stillness beneath it all, the kind that only comes when time itself seems to stretch wider than you can imagine. You would see the horizon open into vast plains where the sky feels larger than the earth below it. You'd watch herds of mammoths moving slowly across the steppe, their breath rising in clouds against the pale air. In the distance, bison would graze in lines that seemed to go on forever, and far beyond them the faint shapes of predators would follow, silent and patient. The cold would bite at your skin, but the world itself would feel alive in a way that is hard to find today. A world of raw, unfiltered scale.
You might stop by the edge of a glacier, its wall rising like a frozen cliff, blue ice gleaming where the sunlight strikes it. Water would trickle down its face in thin streams, the beginning of rivers that would one day carve their way across entire continents. The sound of it would be low and steady, a reminder that even the mightiest walls of ice are never truly still. They breathe, they shift, and eventually they let go. And then if you turned away from the ice and walked into the lands, you'd find traces of human life, a small circle of huts built from bone and hide, smoke rising from a fire at the center. You'd see footprints in the snow, tools laid out for sharpening, and hunters returning from the horizon, their faces marked by wind and sun. These people would look at the same frozen land, not with wonder, but with familiarity. For them, this was not a distant past, it was home. To walk through this world would be to see the earth in one of its most honest forms. No cities, no roads, no walls. Only the slow, patient work of nature, carving and shaping everything over millennia. The Ice Age was not a frozen prison. It was a teacher, a sculptor, and in its own way,
a beginning. And even though it is gone, its presence has never truly left. It lingers in the valleys and lakes carved by its glaciers, in the soil that feeds our crops, in the animals that still roam the coldest edges of the planet. It lives in our own history, in the fires our ancestors built and the tools they carried across the endless snow. If you stand outside on a winter's night, when the air is sharp and the world is still, you can almost feel it, a memory that isn't yours, written in the stones beneath your feet, carried in the wind, whispered by the quiet weight of time itself. The Ice Age is not just something we left behind. It is something that shaped the ground we walk on and the lives we live. Its story is written into the world, and if you listen closely enough, it is still there, faint but steady, like footsteps in ancient snow. And so, as we leave this frozen world behind, we carry it with us. Every glacier, every herd, every violet camp of our ancestors has led to this moment. The Ice Age is gone, but its story remains etched into the earth and into us. When you look at the land, the rivers, the hills, the quiet stretch of sky, you're seeing its legacy. When you feel the chill of winter wind, you're touching something ancient, a faint echo of a world where survival was the only language, and the snow never truly stopped falling. We walk now in a different age, one of warmth and change, but we're shaped by the one that came before. And perhaps, in knowing that, we can better see our place in the story, not as separate from it, but as its continuation. The Ice Age never truly ends. It lingers in stone, in water, in memory, and in the quiet. If you pause long enough to listen, it is still there, waiting.